Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Benjamin Gilmer, author of the brand new nonfiction book, The Other Dr. Gilmer: Two Men, a Murder, and an Unlikely Fight for Justice. Benjamin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sure. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about your book yet, can you explain who the other Dr. Gilmer was and what he did that led you to eventually write this book?
The other Dr. Gilmer was a physician that preceded me in the small clinic where I work in Asheville, North Carolina. As a fledgling doctor, when I started my career, I realized I was walking in the footsteps of a presumed murderer who had the same last name. So it was an interesting adventure to start a career that way. And I soon learned, after inheriting many of the other Dr. Gilmer's patients, and the other Dr. Gilmer's name is Vince, inherited a lot of Vince's patients, and they immediately started sharing with me how much they loved him, how beloved he was in the community. And for the first time, they were able to express their lack of understanding about what happened, like why the other Dr. Gilmer killed his father in a sort of brutal way. So that was my entry into Dr. Gilmer, and hearing his stories and wanting to understand who this person was and why he committed this horrific act, and why he was so beloved by his community.
Sure. Well, I know that you're a practicing physician. What made you decide I want to write a book about this story and this issue?
I never would have been audacious enough to write a story or a book, but this story, after becoming closer and closer to the other Dr. Gilmer, begged me to write it. And it's a story that really crosses a whole decade. It's a story about my own personal development and growth. So it's a memoir, but it's a story that delves into many issues, namely, like, how does a brain unravel, and what is the clinician's responsibility to get involved with social justice. So this story is very much more than a murder mystery story. It's one that grabbed me, and I felt compelled to write about it because it was the story of Vince Gilmer was so inspiring to me, and ultimately pushed me to try to get him out of prison. So it's a story about social justice, and I've been a student writer throughout this whole period. So it's been a massive learning process for me to learn how to write, to practice writing intentionally for the first time. But it's not about me as a writer. It's about telling Vince Gilmer's story.
Sure. Well, in your research of Dr. Vince Gilmer, what explained his change of behavior and the murder of his father?
So there were many things that contributed to why Vince Gilmer sort of unraveled in a moment. And it took a number of years to figure this out. In fact, one of the pillar concepts of the book is why our human brain can become cognitively fallible. Why all of us can drift towards this sort of neurologic state of where we no longer have resiliency. And for many of us, like, that, getting into that space is can be caused by a lack of sleep one night. It could be caused by stress from work. It could be caused by a number of things. But for Vince Gilmer, there was a trilogy of very deep neurologic events that happened to him that contributed to his brain becoming destabilized. The first was that he came off very precipitously from his antidepressant, an SSRI, and that caused SSRI discontinuation syndrome. The second was that he had a traumatic brain injury that can cause all kinds of symptoms, including emotional instability, lability, and cognitive deficits. And then the third really was that I realized, after meeting Vince Gilmer in prison, and seeing him for the first time, I realized that he had some kind of neurologic disorder, which ultimately we diagnosed as Huntington's disease. And that was something that he never knew he had, nor did his father, the person he killed, knew he ever had. So there are many factors that really came together to contribute to Vince killing his father. Those were three. But the other big one was that he experienced intergenerational trauma, sexual abuse from his father's own hands. And so that was the foundation of his upbringing was growing up with abuse.
Well, there's been a recent update to this story about Dr. Vince Gilmer. Can you tell us about that?
So just to paint the backstory a little bit,
Sure.
in 2016, we proposed a clemency petition to the governor of North Carolina that was rejected by then Governor Terry McAuliffe. 4 years later, we pitched another clemency petition to the just recent governor of Virginia, Governor Dr. Ralph Northam, and he rejected our clemency petition too, despite being a neurologist. Those two events really inspired me to get involved with this sort of social justice movement to speak more towards mass incarceration. Miraculously, on the last day, so several months after the governor's clemency rejection, on his last day in office, he reversed his decision and granted clemency to Vince Gilmer. So that has been the culmination of our work over the last 10 years to free him, which he will now soon be free, although he's still in prison currently, because we don't have a hospital yet who's willing to accept him, which was part of our clemency petition. So ironically, he's still in prison, but a free man until we can find a hospital that's willing to accept him. So this has been very big recent news for us, and we're thrilled that the governor came to this conclusion, although it took several years. But we're thrilled that this is happening.
That's great. Well, as you were exposed to Dr. Gilmer's case and you researched this book, what did you discover about how mental illness is handled in the criminal justice system in the U.S.?
So that's a huge question, Jeff, and one that I've been percolating on throughout my career, recognizing that there's such a paucity of resources for people who are mentally ill is tremendous. And so the problem really starts like at a very basic grassroots level, like getting all people access to medical care, having a medical home. That's one of our objectives in family medicine. I've realized like since day one that, that's the difficulty of getting someone in, for example, to see a psychiatrist. As a result of family medicine, we take care of about 20% of our patients are psychiatric in nature. Then after delving into the story and, recognizing that I was very naive to how we treat mental illness in this country, I started to realize that there are much bigger questions looming out there, punctuated by Vince's story. I realized that there are 10 times more people with mental illness who are being treated, or not treated rather, in prison compared to mental hospitals. Like that's so staggering to me. 10 times more people in prison than in mental hospitals. Realizing that 40% of incarcerated people have mental illness. That alone should be a strong signal that we're not doing things well. That rehabilitation for the mentally ill does not happen successfully in prison. Like it happens in a clinical setting. That's just scratching the surface. That I think there's so many things that contribute to the continued worsening of mental illness in our country, punctuated by COVID and everything else. But the bottom line is that there are not enough services. And we don't always recognize that mental illness is an actual illness. I think it's really important, and I tried to outline this in the book, that we all have our moments. We all have our personal threshold for becoming unstable, for becoming depressed or anxious. And if we can recognize that by understanding our shared human kind of cognitive fallibility, that helps us to recognize that being sick with mental illness is in fact that it's a sickness, and that we could do a better job accepting it, recognizing it and treating it, but not incarcerating it. It just does not work. A mentally ill person who enters prison only becomes more mentally ill. They do not become healed.
Hi, this is Jeff, the host of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I wanted to tell you about an app that can change how you plan parties and celebrations at your home. Drizzly. Drizzly is the most convenient way to buy beer, wine, and spirits with delivery to your doorstep in under 60 minutes. Are you hosting a book club party and you need a couple of bottles of wine? Well, keep in mind Drizzly. Or do you and your friends make cocktails based on your favorite book characters or novels? If so, again, use Drizzly. That's DRIZLY.com. Drizzly is the #1 app for alcohol delivery. Again, that's Drizzly, DRIZLY.com. And right now, if you act, Drizzly is giving every new customer $5 off their first order. Just use the promo code FAST5 at checkout. Are you on a search for a special holiday or birthday gift for a reader in your life? A reader who loves history? Well, I've got a suggestion for you. How about giving them weekly historic letters in the mail from Letterjoy? Every week, they'll receive a letter from a famous historical figure or an eloquent eyewitness to a major event. Past Letterjoy letters have included famous defense attorneys, the United States and China, or working on the railroad, exploring the American history of the railroads. For example, one letter was an engineer writing home to his wife to describe the tough process of laying tracks for the Transcontinental Railroad. Every Letterjoy letter arrives at your door on fine stationery or parchment with a real stamp. And each letter also includes the postscript, an article by expert curators on the latest letter and the historical figures and events connected to it. Visit letterjoy.co to give weekly historic letters to the historian in your life. And I have a special offer for listeners of this podcast. Use promo code BOOKS at checkout to get $5 towards your first order. Again, that's letterjoy.co, promo code BOOKS, to give a special gift to the reader in your life. Well, I'm curious, given your research about this topic, are there any particular nonprofits or organizations that are looking at this issue, specifically the intersection of mental illness and mass incarceration in the U.S., and trying to do something about it?
There are many organizations across the country who are trying to contribute to making this argument against the mass incarceration of the mentally ill. They're innumerable, but a few of them come to mind. One is the Marshall Project, which is well recognized in this realm of speaking against the inhumanity of mass incarceration, and calling out the immorality of incarcerating the mentally ill. People like Brian Stevenson, who's been one of the biggest voices in our country speaking out against mass incarceration. He started the Equal Justice Initiative down in Birmingham, or in Montgomery, Alabama. He's the guy that gets in front of the Supreme Court and makes the big arguments. But I think there are lots of grassroots efforts as well that are making excellent contributions. I think that I've tried to better understand and focus what my contribution might be, and I think it's really to bring a lens, like a clinical lens, from a non-biased person, a clinician, to help better reveal that our minds are fragile and that we have to protect one another, and that it's absolutely an affront to the Hippocratic Oath to consider incarcerating someone who has profound mental illness. But it's a collective effort for sure. And there are many people doing great things out there.
Well, this story about Vince Gilmer was originally featured on This American Life, the popular radio show and podcast. How did that podcast episode or radio episode come about?
I was contacted by Sarah Koenig, an amazing journalist, Peabody winner, who had a connection with my cousin. My cousin told her that there was a crazy story evolving with his cousin. And so she reached out to me, and I was not even close to wanting to do a story with her because I felt really vulnerable in that moment and not wanting to make myself known to, at the time, a person that I thought was a brutal murderer. And so there was a certain amount of paranoia that existed in my own brain, in my own life during a time where I had 2 young children and I was trying to start a career. It was like a very, kind of destabilizing period. But eventually I realized that I would not be able to continue my work in that building, the same building that Vince Gilmer actually built, if I didn't come to a closer understanding of the truth about what happened to him. Because he was like a ghost, like living in our building. Sometimes he would be a friendly ghost, and other times he would be a terrifying ghost. And so eventually I crossed that sort of threshold where I knew I had to figure out what happened, and I knew I needed some help to do so. So I called Sarah back, and she jumped in with me, and together we spent 6 months trying to figure out what happened to the other Dr. Gilmer, and eventually diagnosing him with Huntington's disease, which has changed the course of his life and mine.
Well, given the fact that you're a practicing physician, do you have plans to write another book now that you've written this one?
So I have learned, I just want to recognize how much respect I have for people who write, because it's an incredible endeavor to write a book. And I was very naive in approaching this process and really approached it as just, with student eyes, practice writing for a few years. And then I finally asked for help. Like I knew that I was going to need some help, some guidance, some mentorship in the process, and learned that I really loved it. Like that it was such a great experience, although hard to work 60 to 75 hours a week and get up every morning at 5 o'clock to try to put words on a page in a small dark room. But it was so therapeutic that I'm realizing now that, writing can make an impact. Like writing books or articles can, really speaks to people, and that story speaks to people. Story is what ultimately changes people's minds, not argument per se, but a story. And that's why I think this story is so compelling, because it's one that, that is about two people. It's not and it's a true story. It's not one that's made up, or it's not one where I tried to make a dogmatic, argument. It's one where I let the story speak for itself. And so if a story arises again that's as compelling as this one, for me, I would love to pursue writing again.
That's great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Benjamin Gilmer, author of the brand new nonfiction book, The Other Dr. Gilmer, 2 Men, a Murder, and an Unlikely Fight for Justice. The book is on sale now, so go buy a copy. And Benjamin Gilmer, thanks for doing this interview.
Appreciate it, Jeff.
Great.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
At Kroger, we believe fresh means holding our produce to a higher standard. That's why we do up to a 27-point inspection on our produce. Like for citrus, we check for things like scarring and sunburn. Yep, oranges can sunburn, and we'll make sure you never see it. In fact, we only allow the best oranges, lemons, and grapefruits to reach our shelves. Because when it comes to fresh for everyone, we believe the juice is worth the squeeze. Kroger, fresh for everyone.